They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
The prison had been dead for 4 years before I brought it back to life. And sometimes I think that sequence was the problem. That places meant to hold people against their will remember the assignment even when the locks go open and the state pulls the funding. My name is Gerald McRaney. I'm a corrections architect. That means I design the interiors of incarceration facilities, sight lines, traffic flow, controlled choke points, the geometry of human containment. For 11 years, I drew the rooms where people lost portions of their lives. And I thought I understood what it meant to control space. I was wrong about that in a way that took the end of the world to teach me. Moundsville Federal Correctional Complex sat on 87 acres outside Benwood, West Virginia, decommissioned in 2021 after a congressional budget reallocation eliminated its operating funds. The Bureau of Prisons transferred the property to the General Services Administration, which couldn't sell it because no municipality wanted to inherit the remediation costs. It sat empty, razor wire rusting, guard towers collecting pigeon nests, a quarter-mile of reinforced perimeter wall surrounding buildings designed to be breached from neither inside nor out. I knew the facility because I'd consulted on its last renovation in 2019. Updated the medical wing, redesigned the segregation unit, corrected a ventilation deficiency in the kitchen. I knew every corridor, every lock mechanism, every structural weakness and redundancy. When the first outbreak reports surfaced in late September and the infection vectors suggested urban density as the primary accelerant, I did what my professional mind was trained to do. I assessed the landscape for defensible space. The prison was perfect. 30-foot perimeter walls with anti-climb coping, 12-gauge steel doors on magnetic locks backed by manual deadbolts. A diesel generator system rated for 72 hours of full facility operation. A well water system independent of municipal supply. A kitchen with walk-in cold storage. An infirmary with surgical capability. 4 guard towers with 360-degree sight lines. And a design philosophy that assumed its occupants would try every conceivable method of escape, which meant every defensive feature faced inward and could be reversed. I drove to Benwood on October 3rd, 8 days before the governor declared a state of emergency. I brought a truck loaded with tools, provisions, and a laptop containing the facility's complete architectural plans. The GSA lockbox on the main gate yielded to a code I obtained through a former colleague who now worked in federal property management. His name was Terrence Liu. And when I called him for the code, he asked why I wanted access to a decommissioned prison. Research, I said. Delia, the CDC just put out a Level 3 advisory. I know, that's the research. He gave me the code. Terrence was like most people in that first week, aware something was wrong, unwilling to calculate how wrong. He sent me a text 2 hours later. Be careful in there. Structural survey hasn't been done since decom. Floors in B block might be compromised. I didn't hear from him again. His phone stopped connecting on October 9th. I've looked for his name on every survivor registry I've encountered since, and it has never appeared. The facility was exactly as I remembered it, minus the human element. Cell blocks A through D stood in their radial configuration around the central control hub. The administration building anchored the north end. The kitchen and commissary occupied the west wing. The infirmary was east, connected to the main corridor by a breezeway that I noted immediately as a defensive vulnerability. Too much glass, too many entry points, not enough door between here and there. I started working that afternoon, not on fortification, on assessment. I walked every corridor with my plans open on the tablet, marking deviations between the drawings and the current state. Water damage in the B-block basement, a collapsed ceiling section in the segregation wing. Generator fuel tanks at 18% are enough for roughly 13 hours of full operation. The well pump tested functional. The kitchen's cold storage held residual temperature from the facility's thermal mass, but wouldn't stay viable without power. I had 8 days. I had a building designed to contain 400 people. And I had the growing certainty, based on the infection spread models I'd been tracking on my laptop since September, that the wave would reach the Ohio Valley by the second week of October. I started alone. I did not stay alone. On day 2, a man walked through the front gate I'd left open while hauling diesel drums from a fuel depot 12 miles south. He was standing in the vehicle's sally port when I pulled in. A stocky, balding man in his 60s, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots, hands in his pockets, looking up at the guard tower with an expression I recognized from years of watching people enter prison facilities. Not fear, assessment. He was reading the building. His name was Carl Jessup. He'd been a correctional officer at Moundsville for 19 years before the closure. He lived 4 miles away in a house he'd bought in 1998, specifically for its proximity to the facility. When I asked him why he was here, he answered with the plainness of someone who doesn't embellish. Where else would I go? I know this building better than my own kitchen. I didn't want him there. That needs to be said directly. My plan was solitary. My design was for one. I had calculated food consumption, water draw, fuel burn, and maintenance requirements for a single occupant and projected a sustainable timeline of 90 days. Every additional person altered the arithmetic in one direction. But Carl wasn't asking permission. He was standing in a building he'd worked in for 2 decades, and his knowledge of its operational systems exceeded mine. I knew the architecture. He knew the plumbing, the wiring, the generator's temperament, the exact location of every tool closet and maintenance hatch. Within an hour, he'd shown me 3 access points I hadn't identified on the plans. A service tunnel connecting the kitchen to the boiler room, a roof hatch in the infirmary that didn't appear on any drawing, and a drainage culvert under the east wall that was large enough for a person to crawl through. That culvert, he said, pointing at the 18-inch opening where it exited beyond the perimeter wall. Every officer knew about it. We checked it monthly. You'll want to weld it shut. I welded it shut that afternoon while Carl reconnected the generator's fuel line, which had been drained during decommissioning. By evening, we had power. The overheads in the central control hub buzzed to life with a fluorescent reluctance that made the empty corridors look exactly like what they were. A place built to hold people that currently held only 2. Carl cooked dinner in the institutional kitchen, using provisions I'd brought and muscle memory from years of supervising inmate food service. We ate in the officers' mess, a small room adjacent to the kitchen with a single window facing the interior yard. "You're an architect," he said. It wasn't a question. "Corrections architect. Then you know what this place is good at. Keeping people in. Keeping people separated. Containment isn't just walls. It's routing. You control how people move through the building. You control everything." He was right. And the insight landed differently than it would have from anyone else. Carl hadn't read containment theory. He'd practiced it. 20,000 shifts of managing human movement through steel and concrete had given him an understanding of spatial control that was physical rather than conceptual. That night, October 4th, the news carried the first confirmed infection cluster east of the Mississippi. Knoxville, Tennessee. 47 cases, 12 deaths. Containment protocols failing. The footage showed a hospital parking lot where National Guard vehicles formed a perimeter around an entrance that was no longer functioning as an entrance. The camera caught a figure moving beyond the vehicles. Too fast, too low, angled wrong. Before the feed cut, Carl watched the broadcast without expression. When it ended, he turned off the television and looked at me. "How long do we have?" 6 days, maybe 7. Then we work at night. We worked at night. Carl knew the building's rhythms the way a musician knows tempo. When the generator needed rest, when the water pressure peaked, when the heating system cycled. I redesigned the facility's layout for 2, then modified again for a possibility I hadn't yet admitted to myself, more than 2, because the gate was still open, and Benwood was 4 miles away. And 4 miles was walking distance for anyone with a reason to leave home. They arrived in clusters, not organized, organic, the way water finds a low point. October 5th, a family of 4. The Okafor Grants. Louis, a long-haul trucker with 4 arms like bridge cables, and his wife Patricia, who taught 4th grade at the elementary school in Benwood. Their daughters, Kezia and Ruth, were 14 and 11. Louis had heard about the prison from a neighbor who'd seen my truck on the road and connected it to the facility. He drove up in a minivan packed with sleeping bags, canned food, and a hunting rifle he handled with the familiarity of function rather than enthusiasm. "The school closed yesterday," Patricia said. "Not officially. The teachers just stopped showing up." October 6th, 3 more. Bev Stadler, 71, who had been a county dispatcher for 30 years and still carried a handheld scanner that pulled law enforcement frequencies. She arrived in a sedan with 2 people she'd collected on the drive. Marco Reyes, a 26-year-old nursing student from Wheeling who'd abandoned his apartment when the building's other residents started barricading individual units. And a woman named June, who gave no last name and spoke only when asked a direct question. June was perhaps 40, lean, precise in her movements, and carried a duffel bag she kept close and never opened. By the evening of October 6th, we were 9. The arithmetic I'd built for one had been demolished. I sat in the control hub with Carl and my architectural plans and recalculated. Food for 9 at reduced rations, 31 days. Water, unlimited. Fuel, 47 hours of generator time, which we'd need to ration to critical systems only. Medical supplies. What I'd brought plus what Marco had in his nursing kit, which was designed for clinical rotations, not emergencies. "We need more fuel," Carl said. "We need to close the gate," I said. He looked at me. 19 years of correctional service had put something in Carl's eyes that I didn't have. The lived understanding that locking a door is a moral act, not just a mechanical one. Every locked door creates 2 categories of person. He'd spent his career on the privileged side of that division. He knew what it cost. "Not yet," he said. On October 7th, the infected reached Wheeling. Marco heard it on Bev's scanner first. Frantic radio traffic from Wheeling PD, broken transmissions overlapping. The language deteriorating from professional codes to raw description. An officer screaming about a subject who wouldn't go down. A dispatcher repeating an address 3 times because no units were acknowledging. Then a sound that came through the scanner's small speaker and filled the control hub with a frequency I felt in my teeth. An amassed vocalization. Not a scream and not a moan. Something between a chord and a signal, produced by dozens of voices synchronized in a way that human vocal cords aren't supposed to achieve. Bev turned the scanner off. Her hands were steady. 30 years of dispatch had trained her to metabolize crisis orally. But this sound was outside her catalog. "Wheeling's 22 miles north," Carl said. "If they're moving along the river corridor, they reach Benwood by tomorrow night," I said. "If they scatter through the hills, longer. If they follow population density, and everything I've read says they follow population density, the river towns go first." Louis Okafor Grant was standing in the doorway. He'd heard everything. Then we closed the gate. If we close the gate now, anyone still coming from Benwood has until tomorrow to get here. Patricia appeared behind Lewis. She'd been listening from the corridor. You're talking about my neighbors, the Volpe family, the Hernandezes, Margaret Chen, who's 83 and lives alone. I'm talking about math, Lewis said, and his voice carried no cruelty, only the flat weight of a man who drove 70,000 miles a year and had learned to distinguish between what he could control and what he could not. I looked at Carl. Carl looked at the plans spread across the control desk. 24 hours, Carl said. Gate closes at 1800 on the 8th. Anyone who comes before then, we take. After that, the building has to function as designed. Nobody argued, not because they agreed. Because Carl had spoken with the authority of a man who had opened and closed this facility's doors 10,000 times. And his voice carried the institutional weight of the building itself. I spent that night reinforcing the breezeway between the infirmary and the main corridor. I replaced the glass panels with steel sheeting cut from unused bunk frames in D-block. I welded the seams and tested the doors. Marco helped me carry materials, asking careful questions about load-bearing capacity and fastener strength that told me his nursing education had included more engineering curiosity than the curriculum required. At 0300, I stood in the central yard and looked up at the perimeter wall. 30 feet of reinforced concrete, 12 inches thick, with a 4-foot anti-climb extension angled inward at 45 degrees. I had designed that extension. 3 years ago, in an office in Arlington, I had drawn the angle and specified the gauge and calculated the load tolerance. I had designed it to keep people in. Now I was inside it, hoping it would keep something else out. 11 more people arrived on October 8th before the deadline. They came in 3 vehicles and 1 on foot. The vehicles carried the Volpe family. Anthony and Maria, both in their 50s. Their adult son, Dominic, who'd driven down from Morgantown when the university suspended classes. And a retired state trooper named Walt Faber, who arrived alone in a patrol car he'd apparently kept after retirement, wearing civilian clothes but carrying the posture of 30 years in uniform. The person on foot was a teenager. She came through the gate at 1740, 20 minutes before Carl's deadline, wearing a backpack and an expression of specific exhaustion. Not tired from walking, tired from deciding. Her name was Yolanda Watts. She was 17. She'd walked from Benwood after her mother locked her out of the house. "Locked you out?" Patricia asked, already moving toward the girl with the instinct of a teacher who recognizes a child in operational distress. "She's sick," Yolanda said. "She started getting sick yesterday. She told me to leave, and she locked the deadbolt, and she wouldn't answer when I knocked." The room absorbed this. Marco, the nursing student, asked clinical questions. What symptoms? What timeline? Had there been contact with anyone exhibiting unusual behavior? Yolanda answered with the detached precision of someone who has already processed the information and is now only reporting it. Her eyes changed first. Then the coordination. She knocked a glass off the counter and didn't react to it breaking. She just watched the pieces. Then she looked at me, and I knew she wasn't deciding to look at me. Something else was deciding. At 1800, Carl closed the gate. The main vehicle entrance was a dual-leaf steel gate on a motorized track that still functioned. It sealed with a clang that echoed off the perimeter wall and settled into the concrete like a period at the end of a sentence. Carl engaged the manual deadbolt, a 2-inch steel throw that seated into a receiver plate I'd inspected on day 1. He tested it with his weight. It held. We were 20. 9 original, 11 new. I updated the arithmetic on the control hub whiteboard while Carl briefed the new arrivals on the facility layout. rules of movement, and resource allocation. Food, 19 days at reduced rations, assuming no resupply. Water, unlimited. Fuel, 39 hours of generator time after the overnight running I'd done for welding. Medical, Marco's kit plus what the Volpes had brought. Maria was diabetic and carried a 60-day insulin supply that immediately became the most valuable and fragile resource in the building. I assigned housing, cell block A, closest to the control hub, with its 40 single-occupancy cells. Each cell had a steel cot, a toilet, a sink, and a door that locked from outside. The irony was architectural and inescapable. I was putting free people in prison cells and calling it safety. Patricia Okafor Grant looked at the cell I'd assigned her family and said nothing. But her hands went to her daughter's shoulders with a pressure that communicated everything about what it meant to walk voluntarily into a cage. Carl, who had spent 19 years locking these doors on people who hadn't chosen to be here, handled the arrangement with professional detachment that I suspected cost him more than he showed. Walt Faber took a cell at the end of the block without complaint, arranged his belongings with military precision, and asked me a single question. What's the defensive plan? I didn't have one. I had an architectural assessment and a resource inventory and a timeline projection. I did not have a plan for what happened when the infected arrived at the walls. This was the gap between my expertise and the situation. I designed spaces, I didn't defend them. I could tell you the load tolerance of every wall in the building. I couldn't tell you what to do when something hit it. Walt recognized the gap before I articulated it. You're the engineer, I'll be the tactician. Show me the towers and the sight lines, and let me work. By midnight, Walt had established a watch rotation using the 4 guard towers. 3-hour shifts, 2 people per tower, covering the perimeter in overlapping arcs. He'd inventoried our weapons. Lewis's hunting rifle, a shotgun Walt had brought, Carl's old service baton, and a collection of improvised tools, fire axes from the facility's emergency stations, lengths of pipe, a machete Dominic Volpe had packed with the confidence of a 22-year-old who'd watched too many movies. Not enough, Walt said. He said it to me, privately, in the control hub after the others had gone to their cells. 20 people, 2 firearms, and a building with more entry points than I can cover. If they come in numbers, we hold the walls or we don't hold anything. The walls will hold, I said. I don't doubt your walls, Delia. I doubt our ability to keep what's behind them organized. He was right to doubt it. The first fracture appeared on day 2 inside the closed facility, and it had nothing to do with the infected. Dominic Volpe and June, the woman with no last name and the unopened duffel, got into an argument in the kitchen over water usage. The argument itself was minor. Dominic had been filling a container from the tap, and June told him he was wasting flow by letting it run while he searched for a lid. What escalated it was June's tone, which carried an authority that had no visible foundation, and Dominic's response, which carried the indignation of a young man who did not accept correction from strangers. "Who are you to tell me anything?" Dominic said. "You won't even tell us your last name." June looked at him with an expression I'd seen before on the faces of people in professional environments who were deciding how much of themselves to reveal and calculating the cost of each option. "My name is June Ashworth. I was an epidemiologist with the West Virginia Department of Health until 4 days ago, when the department stopped functioning. The reason I haven't told anyone is that the last 3 groups I encountered treated that information as either a reason to demand answers I don't have, or a reason to blame me for not preventing this. I'd prefer to just carry supplies and be useful." The kitchen went quiet. Bev, who'd been washing cans at the industrial sink, turned off the water. Marco, restocking the pantry shelves, set down a case of beans and turned around. "You're an epidemiologist," Marco said. "Was. What do you know about the infection?" "Less than you'd want, more than you'd find comfortable." I stepped into the kitchen. The institutional fluorescents cast the same flat light they'd cast on thousands of inmate meals. And for a moment the scene looked exactly like what the building was designed for. A population being managed, information being controlled, authority being negotiated in a space where the architecture itself was a participant. "Tell us," I said. June looked at me, then at the room, then at the floor. She opened her duffel bag for the first time. Inside were files. Paper files, printed spreadsheets, hand-annotated maps. The analog archive of someone who'd understood early that digital systems wouldn't survive. She spread a map on the stainless steel prep table. It showed the Ohio Valley region with infection spread marked in red. Not the smooth gradient of a computer model, but the jagged, hand-drawn advance of someone plotting real data points in real time. "The infection follows infrastructure," she said. "Roads, power lines, communication networks. Not because the pathogen is airborne or waterborne. Because the infected use human infrastructure to navigate. They follow the paths we built. Cell towers, broadcast antennas, electrical substations. They orient to them the way migrating birds orient to magnetic fields." "They use radio signals?" I asked. "They use electromagnetic fields. All of them. The stronger the local field, the more coordinated their behavior. In areas with dense infrastructure, they form groups. They move with purpose. They exhibit problem-solving capability. In areas with low infrastructure, deep rural, wilderness, dead zones, they degrade. They become disorganized, slow, almost passive." I thought about the prison, about its location. Semi-rural, 4 miles from Benwood, surrounded by farmland and low hills. Low infrastructure density. One cell tower visible from the east wall, maybe 2 miles away. Power lines running along the access road. A modest electromagnetic footprint. "What happens if we reduce the local infrastructure?" I asked. June looked at me the way professionals look at other professionals when the conversation shifts from explanation to collaboration. "If you could eliminate the electromagnetic environment around this facility, kill the power lines, disable the cell tower, shut down every radiating source within a meaningful radius, the infected in this area would lose coordination. They'd still be dangerous individually, but they'd stop functioning as a network." Carl was leaning against the doorframe. "The power lines along the road are on wooden poles. A chainsaw takes them down in an hour. The cell tower is privately owned," Bev said. "Verizon lease on county land, 2 miles east on the ridge." "Can we reach it safely?" Walt asked. "Today, yes," June said. "Tomorrow, I don't know." The conversation had shifted from argument to operation in less than 5 minutes. This is what happens when competent people are given information. They don't debate it, they deploy it. Dominic Volpe, who 60 seconds ago had been arguing about a water tap, was now asking Walt about vehicle routes to the cell tower. June Ashworth, who had hidden her expertise behind silence, was now drawing approach vectors on the map with a carpenter's pencil. I stood at the edge of the group and felt something I hadn't felt since arriving at the prison. The specific vertigo of realizing that the plan you made was obsolete, and the new plan was being built by other people's minds. The cell tower operation happened on October 10th, 1 day before the governor's emergency declaration and 3 days before the infected reached Benwood. Walt led a 4-person team: himself, Lewis, Carl, and Dominic. They took the minivan and Lewis's hunting rifle and a chainsaw from the facility's maintenance shed. I stayed at the prison with the rest of the group. monitoring Bev's scanner and watching the east wall from Tower 2 with binoculars I'd found in the warden's office. The team was gone for 4 hours. When they returned, Carl's face told the story before his words did. Tower's down. We cut the support cables and used the van to pull it. Took the whole structure off the ridge. He paused. The power lines are down too. 6 poles along the access road. No more grid connection. What did you see? I asked. Carl glanced at Lewis. Lewis looked at his hands. There were 3 of them near the tower base, Walt said. He said it the way a trooper delivers a roadside report. Factual, sequenced, emotionally partitioned. Standing around the base like they were receiving something. When we cut the first cable, 2 of them turned toward us. Not fast, not aggressive. They turned the way someone turns when they hear a sound in another room. Curiosity, not hostility. And the third didn't turn. The third dropped. The moment the tower lost structural integrity and the antenna array separated from the transmitter housing, the third one collapsed, like someone cut a string. Just fell? Straight down. Knees, then face. Didn't move again. The other 2? Started walking, directionless, no coordination. One walked into a fence post and just stood there, pressing against it, like it couldn't process the obstacle. June, who'd been listening from the corridor, stepped into the control hub. That's consistent with what I've seen. Remove the signal source and the recently converted lose function entirely. The longer infected retain basic motor capability, but lose networked behavior. They become individual, and individually they're minimal threats. The information restructured everything. We weren't just hiding behind walls. We were sitting in a facility whose design, isolation from dense infrastructure, self-contained power, independent water, accidentally matched the conditions that degraded the enemy's primary capability. And we'd just improved those conditions by eliminating the nearest signal sources. The prison wasn't just defensible, it was disabling. I spent the rest of that day doing something I'd never done in my career. Redesigning a building not to contain a threat, but to repel one. I mapped every electromagnetic source within the facility. The generator's ignition system, the fluorescent ballasts, the intercom wiring, Bev's scanner. Each one was a potential beacon, a whisper of signal in an environment we were trying to make silent. We need to choose, I told the group that evening. Generator power gives us lights, refrigeration for Maria's insulin, and the ability to cook. But it also produces an electromagnetic signature that the infected can detect. Every hour we run it, we're broadcasting our position. Maria Volpe, who had been quiet since arriving, spoke from the back of the room. My insulin needs refrigeration. Without it, I have 72 hours before the dosage becomes unreliable and 2 weeks before I'm in crisis. I know, I said. So the choice isn't generator or no generator. The choice is my life or a silent building. The room heard her. Nobody offered a solution because nobody had one. This was not a structural problem I could solve with steel and concrete. This was the problem my profession never addresses. That buildings serve people, and people have needs that exist in direct opposition to each other. Marco raised his hand, a gesture so instinctively academic that it briefly made the prison mess hall feel like a classroom. Insulin can be kept viable at cool temperatures without refrigeration. The basement level of this facility is naturally below 60 degrees. If we store it properly, insulated, temperature monitored, we might extend viability to 3 weeks without power. Maria looked at Marco. You're sure? No, but I'm less unsure than I am about the alternative. We shut down the generator at 2200 on October 10th. The building went dark. The fluorescence died, and the hum that had underscored every moment since Carl reconnected the fuel line vanished. And in its absence, the prison became what it had been during its 4 years of decommissioned sleep. A concrete vessel full of cold air and silence, holding its breath. The infected reached the outskirts of Benwood on October 12th, and we learned about it not from Bev's scanner, which we'd powered down with everything else, but from Yolanda Watts, who was on watch in Tower 3 and came down the stairs white-faced and speaking in the controlled monotone of someone who has decided that delivery matters more than feeling. There are people on the road, coming from town, maybe 30. They're not walking right. I climbed Tower 3 with Walt. From the platform, using the warden's binoculars, I could see the access road stretching southeast toward Benwood. The road ran straight for half a mile before curving behind a low hill. And on that straight section, figures were moving. Not 30. I counted 46. They moved in the disorganized individual pattern June had described as characteristic of signal-degraded infected. No formation, no coordination. Some walked the road. Others drifted into the adjacent fields and wandered through the stubble of a harvested soybean crop with the aimlessness of wind-blown debris. They're in the dead zone, I said. No tower, no power lines. They've got nothing to organize around. Walt studied them through the binoculars. They're still heading this direction, loosely, like there's a residual pull. The building itself, June said. She'd followed us up and was watching without binoculars, her eyes tracking the distant shapes with the focus of someone reading data rather than witnessing horror. The facility's steel mass, the wiring in the walls, even unpowered. It's the largest conductive structure in the area. They may be orienting to its passive electromagnetic signature. The building is an antenna even when it's turned off. This was the information that broke my design logic. I had shut down every active source. I had cut the grid connection, dropped the cell tower, killed the generator. And the building itself. My building, the structure I'd chosen specifically for its defensive properties, was attracting them by existing. Its mass, its metal, its sheer physical presence in the electromagnetic landscape was a beacon I couldn't dismantle without dismantling the walls that protected us. The infected reached the perimeter wall by mid-afternoon, not as a wave, as a scatter. Individual figures arriving at the concrete face and stopping, pressing against it, moving along its base with the blind persistence of insects following a pheromone trail. From Tower 3, I watched a woman in a hospital gown place both palms flat against the wall and stand there, head tilted, as if listening to something inside the concrete. They didn't climb. They didn't strike the wall. They congregated. By evening, I counted over 60 distributed along the south and east faces, standing in loose proximity, each one oriented toward the wall with the same head tilt. They were receiving something from the structure, not enough signal to coordinate, but enough to hold them. The prison had become a kind of low-grade signal source, and they were gathered around it the way June had described the infected gathering around the cell tower. Carl stood beside me in the tower and watched the scene below with an expression I couldn't read. I spent 19 years keeping people inside these walls, he said. I never imagined I'd be watching from the inside, while something pressed against the outside, trying to get in. They can't get in. The walls are 12-inch reinforced concrete. The gates are locked. I know the specs, Delia. I walked this perimeter 10,000 times. What I'm telling you is that having them out there changes things in here. These people, he gestured toward the cell block behind us, are not inmates. They didn't sign up for confinement. And the sound of bodies against concrete at 3 in the morning will do things to civilian minds that you and I can't predict. He was right. By the second night of perimeter congregation, the sound had become a constant presence. Not loud, not violent, but unceasing. A low percussion of hands and shoulders and foreheads against concrete, a rhythmic and individual, producing a collective murmur that penetrated the walls not as vibration, but as knowledge. They were out there, touching the building, feeling for us through 12 inches of aggregate and steel. Kezia Okafor Grant, the 14-year-old, stopped sleeping. Her sister Ruth drew pictures on cell walls with a pencil stub. Not the pictures an 11-year-old normally draws, but architectural plans. Floor plans of the prison, reproduced from memory after walking the corridors once. They were accurate, disturbingly accurate. The kind of spatial cognition that either indicated prodigious talent or a mind that had converted anxiety into mapping as a survival response. I found Ruth's drawings on the third night and studied them. She'd identified something I'd missed, a maintenance access point in the floor of the kitchen's dry storage room, marked on my plans as a sealed utility chase, but drawn by Ruth as an open shaft with a ladder. I looked through the grate, she told me. It goes down. There's air moving. The shaft descended 14 feet into a utility corridor that ran beneath the kitchen and commissary wing, a service tunnel for plumbing and electrical that appeared on my original renovation plans as a sealed, non-accessible space. It was not sealed. The access grate Ruth had found was loose, resting in its frame without fasteners. The tunnel extended roughly 200 feet east-west, with branch connections to the main building's subsurface infrastructure. I went down with Carl in a battery-powered lantern. The tunnel was 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, walkable but claustrophobic, lined with pipes and conduit, the floor a poured concrete slab with drainage channels. It smelled of mineral water and rust. The air moved, as Ruth had noted, flowing east to west with enough pressure to indicate a connection to the outside. We followed the tunnel west. It terminated at a concrete wall that showed signs of modification. Newer pour, different aggregate color, a patch job done within the last decade. Behind the wall, based on my plans and the facility's layout, was the mechanical room for the commissary's refrigeration system. This was sealed during the 2019 renovation, I said. I remember the work order. The contractor closed off the tunnel access because the new refrigeration units needed the floor space. But the tunnel itself goes further east, Carl said, pointing back the way we'd come. We reversed direction and followed the tunnel east, past the kitchen branch, past a junction where a vertical shaft rose to what I estimated was the infirmary above. The tunnel continued, narrowing slightly, the conduit thinning to a single electrical run and a 4-inch water main. At approximately the 200-foot mark, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, 8 by 10 feet, with a heavy steel door set in the east wall. The door was locked, not with a modern mechanism, with a mortise lock that predated the facility's renovation by decades. The door itself was painted gray over what looked like original ironwork. Carl studied it. This is pre-renovation, might be pre-conversion. Before this was a federal facility, it was a state institution, 1800s. Some of the original substructure was never fully documented. I examined the lock. It was simple, a lever mechanism that required a key I didn't have. But the door frame was set in concrete that had cracked along the hinge side, creating a gap wide enough to see through. I pressed my eye to the gap. Beyond the door was another tunnel, older, rougher, not poured concrete but cut stone, running approximately northeast. The air coming through the gap was cold and smelled of earth, not minerals. This tunnel ventilated to the surface somewhere beyond the prison's perimeter. That's our vulnerability, I said. If the infected can find the surface opening of that tunnel, they have a path under the wall. Carl and I spent 6 hours sealing the door. We carried bags of concrete mix from the maintenance shed, 50-pound sacks that the facility kept for minor repairs, and mixed them in the tunnel using water from the main. We built a plug around the door frame, filling the gap, encasing the hinges, adding a second layer across the full face. When we finished, the door was buried under 8 inches of fresh concrete that would cure to a compressive strength of 4,000 pounds per square inch within 48 hours. While we worked underground, the situation above changed. Bev intercepted it on the scanner, which she'd turned on briefly against the group's agreement because 30 years of dispatch habit outweighed 48 hours of protocol, a transmission on a military frequency not encrypted, either deliberately or by failure, described a convoy movement along Interstate 79 southbound. The convoy was military. Its destination was described as a forward consolidation point in the Kanawha Valley near Charleston. The transmission included a fragment that made Bev replay it 3 times. Civilian collection authorized at designated waypoints. Repeat. Collection authorized. Waypoint designations follow. The waypoints were GPS coordinates. Bev wrote them down. The nearest was 18 miles south, on Route 2 along the Ohio River. She brought the information to the evening meeting. All 20 of us assembled in the officers' mess because it was the only room that could hold everyone. The atmosphere had shifted since the infected arrived at the walls. Fear had stratified into distinct responses. The Okafor Grant family drew inward, Patricia positioning herself between her daughters and every door. Anthony and Maria Volpe argued in whispered Italian about whether to stay or attempt to reach Maria's sister in Pittsburgh. An argument made hypothetical by the infected perimeter, but kept alive by Maria's need to believe in alternatives. Walt maintained operational focus, treating the crisis as a tactical problem with a tactical solution. Yolanda, the 17-year-old who'd walked away from her locked-out mother, attached herself to Bev with the quiet orbit of someone who needed proximity to competence. And June Ashworth, the epidemiologist, watched it all with the diagnostic attention of someone who understood that the group's internal dynamics were a more immediate threat than the figures against the wall. 18 miles, Lewis said, looking at the coordinates Bev had transcribed. Through what? River Road. Low infrastructure density after we dropped the tower and the power lines. June's model suggests degraded infected behavior for the full route. Suggests, Patricia said. Nothing is confirmed, June answered. But the signal environment between here and that waypoint is the weakest in the region. If we're going to move, that's the corridor. I listened and said nothing. Because the question forming in my mind was not whether we could reach the waypoint. It was whether we should leave a building that I had spent 10 days turning into the most defensible position in the Ohio Valley. A building whose passive electromagnetic signature attracted the infected precisely because it was the largest, most solid, most secure structure for miles. The prison's strength was its weakness. Its presence was its liability. And the only way to resolve the contradiction was to leave. I spent the night of October 14th alone in the control hub, redrawing the building, not physically, on paper. I took my original architectural plans and overlaid them with everything I'd learned. June's infrastructure signal correlation, Carl's operational knowledge, the tunnel system, the passive attraction effect, the infected's behavioral degradation in signal-poor environments. I drew the prison not as a fortress, but as a diagram of competing forces. Defensive strength pulling inward, electromagnetic presence pushing outward, human need fracturing along both axes. The drawing told me what Carl and Walt and June and even 11-year-old Ruth already knew. This building would hold, but it would not save us. The walls would stand for months. The infected would remain at the perimeter for as long as the structure's conductive mass kept whispering to them. Our food would run out in 17 days. Maria's insulin, stored in the basement cold, would degrade in 14. The well water would sustain our bodies while the sound of hands on concrete eroded our minds. The prison was doing what prisons do, holding its population in place while the calendar consumed them. At 0400, I went to Carl's cell. He was awake, sitting on his cot, reading a paperback Western by candlelight. He looked up and read my face without needing the words. "You've decided," he said. "We leave. All 20. Through the tunnel system to the eastern surface exit, which bypasses the perimeter congregation. Then south to the military waypoint. The tunnel exit you sealed with 8 inches of concrete. The exit to the old tunnel, yes. But the utility tunnel itself has the vertical shaft to the infirmary. From the infirmary roof hatch, the one you showed me on day 1, we can access the roof. From the roof, the east wall is 12 feet below. We lower people down on the outside. The infected are concentrated on the south and west faces. The east face had the lowest count at last watch. 11 individuals. 11 infected between us and open ground. 11 disorganized, signal-degraded, functionally passive individuals who couldn't coordinate a turn toward sound in the current signal environment. We walked past them the way we'd walk past sleepwalkers. Carl set down his book. And if you're wrong, then we're wrong on the east wall instead of starving inside a building that's attracting more of them every day. He nodded. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. The nod of a man who'd spent 2 decades making binary decisions about doors, open or shut, locked or unlocked, containment or release. When? Tomorrow night, 2100. Darkness covers the roof descent. We move south through the fields, 18 miles to the waypoint by dawn. The children. I know. Maria's mobility. I know. June's data is based on a model, not a guarantee. I know that too, Carl. He stood and put on his boots. The same work boots he'd worn every day, institutional brown, steel-toed. Then I'll brief Walt. You brief the families. I briefed the families at 0600. Patricia Okafor Grant listened with her hands flat on the table, pressing down, as if keeping herself in place. Lewis asked 3 logistical questions and accepted the answers. Maria Volpe asked about insulin transport. Marco answered he'd already prepared an insulated carrier using materials from the infirmary. Anthony Volpe said nothing, but moved closer to his wife. A gravitational adjustment that communicated consent. Yolanda Watts asked the question nobody else would. What about the people who don't want to go? The room looked at her. She was 17 and had already made one choice to walk away from a locked door. She understood the mechanics of departure better than any of us. Nobody is required to leave, I said. The building will remain standing. The water will continue to work. Anyone who stays will have shelter. But not food. Not indefinitely. So the choice is leave now with the group or stay alone with the walls. Yes. Then nobody's staying, she said. Because that's not a choice, that's a sentence. The word landed in the room with the precision of someone who understood, at 17, the exact nature of the building we were in. Yolanda had walked away from one locked door to get here. She was not going to die behind another. Nobody stayed. We spent October 15th preparing to abandon the most defensible position I had ever occupied. The preparation was more emotional than logistical. The physical requirements were simple. Water bottles, food parcels, Maria's insulin carrier, the 2 firearms, flashlights with taped lenses to limit light scatter. What was difficult was the act of packing to leave a place that felt safe, while knowing that the feeling was a lie, that the walls were attracting the very thing they protected against. That every hour we remained increased the perimeter population by an increment I could calculate, but not control. June spent the day updating her signal environment map for the route south. She worked with Bev, who knew the terrain from decades of dispatching emergency vehicles through it, and Marco, who had an intuitive grasp of topography from years of hiking the West Virginia hill country on weekends between clinical rotations. They identified 3 risk points: a bridge crossing where infrastructure density spiked briefly, a stretch where the route passed within half a mile of a residential cluster, and the waypoint approach itself, which required entering a zone where military communications equipment would be active. The military signal environment is the biggest unknown, June said. If their equipment is high-power broadcast, which it will be, the infected in that area may be highly coordinated. Then how are they operating a collection point? Lewis asked. Perimeter defense, hardware. Enough firepower to hold a signal-dense zone by force. So we're walking toward the loudest point in the region, surrounded by the most organized infected, hoping the military can hold the door open long enough for 20 civilians to walk through. That is accurate. Lewis looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Kezia and Ruth. The girls looked at each other with the shared frequency of sisters who have developed a private communication channel that adults can observe but not decode. We'll be there, Lewis said. At 1900, 2 hours before departure, something changed at the perimeter. Walt reported it from Tower 2, the infected along the south wall. The largest concentration, roughly 80 individuals, had shifted, not randomly, collectively. They turned from the wall and faced south. All of them, simultaneously. The same head tilt, the same orientation. They held it for approximately 90 seconds. Then they began walking, south, away from the prison, into the dark fields beyond the facility's grounds. I climbed the tower and watched through binoculars. The figures moved with more coordination than I'd seen from them since the cell tower came down. Not full network behavior, but something intermediate. Loose clustering, shared direction. As if a faint signal had reached them from the south. Too weak to fully activate the network, but strong enough to provide a bearing. The military waypoint, June said from behind me. She'd followed me up. They're activating for the collection window, powering up communications. The signal is reaching this far north and giving the degraded infected a directional pull. They're walking toward the waypoint. Yes. The same waypoint we're walking toward. Yes. The mathematics of this were straightforward and merciless. The military was turning on equipment to coordinate a civilian collection operation. That equipment was broadcasting into a signal environment we had deliberately silenced. The broadcast was reactivating infected across an 18-mile corridor and drawing them toward the exact point where 20 civilians were supposed to arrive at dawn. Do we still go? I asked June. She took a long time answering. Not because she was uncertain. I could see the calculation completing behind her eyes. But because she understood that the answer would commit 20 people to a decision based on her model, and the model had never been tested at this scale. The infected are moving at walking speed. We can move faster if we push. If we leave now, not at 2100 now. We can reach the waypoint before the perimeter congregation does. The leading edge of this group won't arrive until 3 or 4 hours after us. The military will be collecting. We arrive during the window. We get inside the perimeter. The infected arrive at a defended position instead of an open road. And if the military doesn't hold, Then we're in the same position we'd be in here, minus the walls. I made the decision in the time it took to climb down from the tower. Not because I was certain, because Yolanda was right. Staying was a sentence, and leaving was the only act that resembled a choice. "We go now," I told the group. "Not 2100, now." The roof descent was the most technically difficult thing I'd done at the facility. 20 people, including 2 children, a diabetic woman with limited mobility, and a 71-year-old dispatcher, lowering themselves 12 feet from a prison roof to the ground on the east side of the perimeter wall using knotted bed sheets tied to a ventilation housing. Walt went first, rifle slung, dropping to the ground and scanning the immediate area. The east perimeter was nearly clear. Most of the infected had moved south in response to the military signal. 3 figures remained, standing at the base of the wall roughly 60 meters north of our descent point, motionless and undirected. Carl went second. Then Lewis, who positioned himself at the base to receive the children. Kezia came down with the controlled athleticism of a 14-year-old who trusted the physics of the sheet more than the adults who'd tied it. Ruth descended in Lewis's arms, lowered by Carl from above, her face pressed against her father's neck. Maria Volpe required the most time. Anthony descended first and stood below while Dominic and Marco lowered Maria in a harness improvised from a bedsheet and the straps of 2 backpacks. She came down slowly, her insulin carrier clutched against her chest, her breathing audible but controlled. When her feet touched the ground, Anthony took her hand and didn't release it. Nor, I haven't mentioned that June climbed down with the silent competence of someone who had done physically demanding field work, and that Bev descended with the deliberate care of a woman who understood her own limitations and compensated for them with precision rather than speed. Yolanda was the last civilian down. She descended quickly, landed lightly, and immediately oriented south. I was last. I stood on the roof of the infirmary and looked back at the prison. The cell blocks, the towers, the yard, the perimeter wall that I had trusted with our lives for 12 days. The building was dark, silent. The concrete held its shape against the night sky like a monument to a logic that had been correct in every technical dimension and wrong in the one that mattered. A fortress that protected its occupants from the threat while simultaneously summoning it. I climbed down and didn't look back again. We moved south through harvested fields. The stubble crunched underfoot. 20 people make noise that no amount of caution can eliminate. And I stopped trying to enforce silence after the first quarter mile. Speed mattered more. The 3 remaining infected near the wall didn't respond to our departure. They stood in their signal-degraded stupor and let us walk away. The route followed the terrain June and Bev had mapped, low ground between ridges, avoiding the residential cluster by cutting through a farm property whose buildings stood dark and empty. The bridge crossing was our first risk point. A 2-lane span over Grave Creek that ran parallel to a power line corridor. The power lines were dead. The regional grid had failed days ago. But the infrastructure itself remained, and June's model predicted residual signal attraction effects from the conductive mass of the cables and towers. At the bridge, we found 6 infected standing on the span. They were oriented south, like the perimeter group, pulled by the military signal, but they weren't moving. They stood in a loose line across the road as if they'd walked to the bridge and stopped, unable to process the obstacle of water beneath them or the openness of the span. Walt assessed the situation in seconds. We go around. Creek's shallow enough to ford 100 meters downstream. We forded. The water was knee-deep and cold enough to make Maria gasp. Dominic and Lewis flanked her, holding her arms. Sammy. I've been calling Ruth by the wrong. The children crossed between their parents, water darkening their clothes to mid-thigh. Nobody spoke. The creek's sound covered our movement. The 6 infected on the bridge did not turn. On the far side, we climbed the bank and resumed the southern bearing. Behind us, the prison was invisible, lost behind the ridgeline, absorbed into the landscape. Ahead, somewhere beyond the dark horizon, the military waypoint waited with its signal blazing and its perimeter armed and its collection window open for people who no longer had a building to return to. Dawn reached us 4 miles from the waypoint. The light came as a gray intrusion through overcast, revealing terrain I'd navigated by feel for hours. Rolling farmland, fence lines, a 2-lane road we paralleled without walking on. The group was strung out over 100 meters, fatigue creating a natural spacing that Walt had tried to correct twice before accepting it as the pace the weakest members could maintain. Mariah was slowing. The cold creek crossing had depleted her reserves, and the insulin dose Marco had administered at 0300 was approaching the edge of its effective window. She walked with Anthony's arm around her waist and Dominic carrying her pack. And the expression on her face was one I recognized from years of working in institutional settings, the look of a person managing pain privately because public acknowledgement would slow the group. Patricia had been carrying Ruth on her back for the last 2 miles. The 11-year-old had stopped walking at a fence crossing and simply sat down, not dramatically, not in protest, but with the physical honesty of a body that had reached its operational limit. Patricia had swung her onto her back without breaking stride, the motion so fluid it spoke of years of carrying sleeping children from cars to beds. I walked at the center of the group, where June had positioned me after our last rest stop. "You're the structural knowledge," she'd said. "If we lose you to a perimeter incident, the military loses everything you know about the prison, the tunnel system, and the defensive modifications you made. Stay center." It was the first time I'd been told my value was informational rather than operational. I'd spent 12 days being the architect, the person who designed, modified, reinforced. Now I was cargo, knowledge in transit. The building had been left behind, and what mattered was what I'd learned inside it. At 2 miles out, we heard the waypoint. Not saw, heard. The sound of diesel generators, multiple, running at high output. The sound of vehicle engines. The sound of amplified voice, indistinct at this distance, but carrying the cadence of instructions repeated on a loop. And beneath it, around it, the other sound. The masked harmonic I'd heard on Bev's scanner when Wheeling fell. The infected were there. Between us and the waypoint, drawn by the same signal that had pulled our perimeter congregations south, assembled in numbers that became visible as we crested a low rise and looked down into the river valley. The waypoint was a parking area adjacent to a river lock facility on Route 2. Military vehicles formed a perimeter. Humvees, armored personnel carriers, 2 flatbed trucks with mounted equipment I couldn't identify. Floodlights illuminated the interior of the perimeter. Inside, I could see movement of soldiers, civilians, the organized choreography of a collection operation in progress. Outside the perimeter, the infected were present in hundreds. They circled the military position the way the smaller group had circled the prison, drawn to the signal, pressing against the barrier. Individual and discoordinated in the dead zones, between equipment but clustering and coordinating where the signal was strongest. The military held them with firepower and physical barriers, but the energy of the confrontation was visible, even from 2 miles away. A seething, persistent pressure that tested every seam of the perimeter continuously. Between us and the perimeter, a mile of open ground crossed by the road and bordered by the river. Infected scattered through it, more concentrated near the perimeter, thinner at the edges. The signal gradient June had described was visible in their behavior. Near the military equipment, they moved in coordinated clusters. Farther out, they degraded to individuals. At the extreme range, they stood motionless, tilted, receiving. "We need to cross that," Lewis said. Walt studied the field through his scope. "The low-density zone is our window, edge of their signal range. The infected there are passive, receiving but not acting. We move through them fast. We reach the perimeter. We identify ourselves, and the military lets us in. And if they don't recognize us as civilians in the dark, it won't be dark. The floodlights illuminate 300 meters out. They'll see us. So will everything else." Walt lowered the rifle and looked at the group. 20 people, 2 children, 1 diabetic, 1 71-year-old, 17 others in varying states of physical depletion after an 18-mile night march. He was calculating the same thing I was, not whether we could make the crossing, but whether everyone could make it at the same speed. June stepped forward. The signal gradient creates behavioral zones. At the outer edge, the infected are functionally inert. As we move closer to the perimeter, their coordination increases. The last 300 meters, inside the floodlight zone, will be the most dangerous because the signal density is highest and the infected are most active. So we sprint the last 300 meters. The people who can sprint, sprint. The people who can't need to be carried. Lewis looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Maria. Maria looked at the distant floodlights and straightened her spine with a deliberation that cost her visible pain. "I can walk fast," Maria said. "Don't carry me. Don't slow down for me. Just point me at the light." We descended into the valley at 06:15, 20 people in a column that Walt organized by capability. The fastest and most physically capable at the front and rear. The children and Maria in the center. The firearms distributed between Walt at point and Lewis at drag. I walked beside Maria, not because I'd been assigned to her, but because she'd asked me. "You designed a prison," she said as we started down the slope. "Now walk me out of one." The first 500 meters were through open farmland, and the infected presence was sparse. 3 figures visible to the east, all motionless, all tilted south toward the signal source. We passed within 40 meters of one. A man in coveralls, standing in a plowed furrow, his boots sunk 3 inches into the mud. His eyes were open, and his mouth moved slightly, not forming words, but articulating something below the threshold of sound. A transmission, maybe. A fragment of the network's chatter, processed through vocal cords that still remembered how to shape air into language. We passed him. He didn't move. At 1 kilometer from the perimeter, the density increased. Figures appeared in groups of 2 and 3, spaced irregularly across the landscape. They were mobile now. Slow, undirected, but mobile. Walking in small patterns that circled without arriving, like animals in a holding pen. The signal was stronger here, enough to activate motor function, but not enough to provide direction beyond the general pull of the military equipment. Walt held up a fist, and the column stopped. Ahead, between us and the flood-lit perimeter, a cluster of 12 infected occupied a section of road directly in our path. They were the most coordinated group we'd encountered on the crossing, moving together, maintaining spacing, their head tilts synchronized. The military signal had reached sufficient strength here to reconstitute basic network function. "We go around," Walt said, "east through the field. Adds 200 meters but avoids direct contact." We detoured east. The field was stubble and mud, slowing our pace. Kezia took Ruth's hand and pulled her along with the focused determination of an older sister who has decided that her primary function is locomotion, not emotion. Bev walked with her scanner off and her head up, navigating by the floodlight glow that was now visible as a dome of illumination against the overcast sky. At 300 meters, we entered the light. The transition was immediate and disorienting. One step, darkness and shadow. The next, floodlight illumination that bleached the landscape to the flat white of an operating theater. We could see the perimeter clearly now. The vehicles, the sandbags, the soldiers in positions along the barrier. And they could see us. A voice on a loudspeaker. "Approaching group, identify yourselves." Walt shouted, "20 civilians, 2 children. No infected contact, requesting entry." A pause. The longest 3 seconds of my life. Then, approach on the road. Single file, hands visible. We formed a line on the road. Hands up, palms forward, walking toward the gap in the vehicle perimeter where 2 soldiers stood with weapons ready. The infected between us and the perimeter, maybe 30, scattered across the illuminated zone, reacted to our movement. Not aggressively, curiously, heads turning, bodies orienting, the coordinated attention of a network that had detected new input and was processing it. "Keep walking," Walt said. "Steady pace, don't run." We walked. Maria's pace was the pace. Nobody moved faster. Nobody moved slower. 20 people walking in a line toward a gap in a wall of steel and light, surrounded by figures that watched with the hollow attention of receivers tuned to a frequency we couldn't hear. At 50 meters, 2 soldiers came forward and flanked our line, weapons outward. "Move, move, move," one of them said, the urgency in his voice contradicting our instructed, steady pace. We moved. Through the gap, past the vehicles, into the perimeter, where the floodlights were even brighter and the generator noise was a physical presence, and the smell of diesel and human habitation replaced the cold field air. Maria crossed the perimeter line and her legs gave out. Anthony caught her. Marco was beside them in seconds, checking her pulse, her pupils, reaching for the insulin carrier. Yolanda Watts was the last civilian through the gap. She turned and looked back at the field we'd crossed. The flood-lit expanse, the scattered figures, the darkness beyond. And her face held an expression I'd seen once before, on the day she'd arrived at the prison. The specific exhaustion of someone who has walked away from a locked door and does not intend to do it again. The military waypoint processed us with the efficient impersonality of an institution doing its designed function. Medical screening in a tent. Names recorded on a clipboard. Vital signs taken by a medic who worked with the same focused economy Simone would have. Hands moving, eyes assessing, mouth closed. Maria received an insulin injection from military medical stores and sat in a folding chair with her eyes closed and her hand in Anthony's, and the specific relief of a crisis that had been structural rather than sudden. I found the commanding officer, a captain named Reeves, mid-30s, operating on caffeine and discipline, and gave him a compressed account of the prison facility, its location, its construction, its defensive properties, its electromagnetic attraction effect, the tunnel system, the modifications I'd made, the reason we'd left. He listened with a tablet in his hand, taking notes, asking questions that were architectural rather than tactical. "You're saying the building's passive conductive mass attracts the infected even without active power?" The largest metallic structure in a signal-poor environment becomes the dominant feature. They orient to it. They congregate. And in a signal-rich environment, the building becomes irrelevant. They orient to the strongest active source. He looked at the generators powering his perimeter floodlights. Which right now is us. Which right now is you. He processed this. Can the building be modified to eliminate the passive signature? You'd have to remove the steel. The rebar, the doors, the conduit, the infrastructure. You'd have to turn it back into raw concrete. At that point, you've destroyed what makes it defensible. So it's a trap. It's a building designed to hold people. It does that regardless of who's inside and who's outside. Reeves studied me. You designed prisons. I designed the interiors. Is there a difference? I used to think so. He assigned me to the convoy that departed at 0900, a column of vehicles heading south to the Kanawha Valley Consolidation Point. All 20 of us loaded into a covered truck that smelled of canvas and motor oil. The Okafor Grants sat together, Ruth asleep on Patricia's lap, Kezia awake and watching the road through a gap in the canvas. The Volpes sat with Marco, who was monitoring Maria's blood sugar with a borrowed glucometer. Bev and Yolanda sat together, the 71-year-old dispatcher and the 17-year-old runaway, sharing a canteen in a silence that had become its own vocabulary. June Ashworth sat beside me. She had her files open on her lap, the hand-annotated maps, the infection spread data, the signal correlation analysis. She was updating them with observations from the crossing. The behavioral zones held, she said. The gradient was predictable. The model works. For this terrain. For any terrain with mappable infrastructure. The variable isn't geography, it's signal density. Map the signals, you map the threat. Carl sat across from us, his back against the truck's sidewall, his work boots planted on the bed. He hadn't spoken since we'd entered the perimeter. He was looking at nothing, or at something internal. The memory of a building he'd walked 10,000 times, now empty again, holding its shape against the West Virginia sky while the figures gathered at its base and pressed their palms to the concrete and tilted their heads and listened for something the walls had never been designed to say. Carl, he looked at me. Thank you for opening the gate when I wanted to close it, for every person we carried out. He nodded, the nod of a man who had spent his career on the wrong side of locked doors and had finally, in the last act of his professional life, stood on the right one. The convoy moved south. The road was clear. The morning light was flat and cold, and the hills of the Ohio Valley rolled past the canvas opening like the pages of a book I'd been reading wrong for 11 years, thinking I understood the architecture of containment when what I'd really been studying all along was the architecture of release. The consolidation point in the Kanawha Valley held 400 people when we arrived, and grew to 1,200 within a week. I was assigned to the engineering corps, not designing containment anymore, but designing infrastructure removal. My new role was to map the electromagnetic environment surrounding each safe zone and identify which transmission sources to eliminate and in what order. I was designing silence, carving dead zones into a landscape we'd spent a century saturating with signal. Every tower I marked for removal was something humanity had built to connect itself. And every removal made the disconnected world a fraction safer for the people still in it. June's model became operational doctrine. Bev trained military dispatchers. Marco completed a field medic certification. Walt commanded a perimeter unit. The Okafor Grants lived in a housing module where Ruth drew maps of every building she entered, her spatial mind converting anxiety into cartography that the engineering corps used more than once. Yolanda Watts applied for and received a role in survivor intake processing. She stood at the gate and opened it for every arrival, and she never asked anyone to justify their presence. Carl Jessup worked maintenance. He fixed pipes and wiring and doors, the quiet labor that keeps a building alive. He never spoke about the prison. But on clear nights, I'd find him standing at the compound's edge, facing north, reading the horizon with the practiced assessment of a man who knows exactly how far away his walls are and has chosen to live outside them.